Hello, my name is Kiran Joni. This is the third part of the 8th session of the introduction series of the Eso-Loop Framework. In the last session, I completed introducing context-free constraints. I introduced 6 default context-free constraints. They are agency, diversity, affordances, adaptiveness, evolvability, and a permanent work in progress. These are called default context-free constraints because if somebody uses this framework, these default constraints will become the default constraints of the users of this framework. I demonstrated this idea by using the example of Iron Man suit. If somebody uses the Iron Man suit, the powers and capabilities of the Iron Man suit will become the powers and capabilities of the users of the suit, whether they know how to use it or not. Similarly, if somebody uses this framework, they cannot ignore agency. They must be concerned about agency. They must cultivate appropriate type of agency, which is relational and inactive. They must be concerned about agency hijacking efforts by people, institutions, ideas, etc. This is because agency is closely related to the idea of autonomy, and autonomy is necessary for self-organization. Second key default context-free constraint is diversity. By using this framework, the users of this framework cannot ignore diversity. They must cultivate appropriate type of diversity, functional diversity, and they must also regulate diversity depending on the context. Further, the users of this framework must be concerned about affordances, must be concerned about adaptiveness, evolvability, and finally, the users of this framework cannot ignore the idea that the framework itself should be a permanent work in progress. If somebody uses this framework, they have the freedom to develop this framework, as in the case of open source software development. They can add things, they can introduce new ideas inside the system. This is an evolvable system. So these were the key context-free constraints we discussed till now. Now, in this part, we are going to look into the second key type of constraints, which is context-sensitive constraints. According to Alicia Herrero, context-sensitive constraints synchronize and correlate previously independent parts into a systemic whole. When organized into a complex integral whole, parts become correlated as a function of context-dependent constraints imposed on them by the newly organized system in which they are now embedded. Now, as I already mentioned, my use of Alicia Herrero's framework of context-sensitive and context-free constraint is not to represent her articulation accurately, but to make use of her idea to design a solution for entrepreneurs. So, particularly the idea of context-sensitive constraints here is not used to represent her idea accurately, but as an enabling constraint that scaffolds entrepreneurial exploration towards certain key attractor dimensions. This idea will be elaborated in a while, but the key point is that I cannot represent real context a priori. So I cannot claim to represent Alicia Herrero's framework accurately when I'm designing a solution. But even though this is the case, the ultimate intention here is to bring the entrepreneur towards the original meaning as intended by Alicia Herrero. So let me articulate this idea much more clearly. In many of the systems in the world, like football, tennis game, railways, road transport, or even in the case of plantation, because these systems have some level of structured, predictable nature, a designer might be able to design enabling constraints a priori. Beforehand, they might be able to design in various constraints by targeting certain dimensions. It can be direct, and also in many cases, best practices might exist. Some examples might be scaffolding a plan with sticks, introducing a new railway crossing, introducing new traffic rules, etc. The problem with entrepreneurship is that it is an ill-structured complexity domain, as we already discussed. Every entrepreneurial context is different, and inside every context, there are multiplicity of nested and emergent contexts. It can be related to entrepreneurial actions, team members, partners, mentors, end user preference, technology penetrations, government policy, infrastructure, etc. The key difference here is that the possible state is far more unprestatable, unknowable, unpredictable when compared to structured systems, like, for example, a football game. In the domain of entrepreneurship, there can be no goal stability, there can be no state space stability. In the case of a football game, for example, there is goal stability, there is a goal post always. There are strict rules to how to score a goal. There is also state space stability. There is a football ground, that is a state space. But that is not the case of entrepreneurship. The venture can be started in a village. Then after several years, it can become a global company. Now, given this complexity and limitations of the domain of entrepreneurship, the key question I try to address here is that given this situation, what can I do best to help the entrepreneur by using this framework, by designing a framework? To recall what we did until now, I completed introducing effectual self-organization and context-free constraints. The significance of these two dimensions are that they are much more fundamental, or they are the ground over which we are standing now. As we observed, since the domain of entrepreneurship is ill-structured with a lot of unknowns, we cannot design something like a goalpost or a traffic signal to regulate context-sensitive dynamics. This is why we are using context-sensitive constraints here as exploratory dimensions and not as specific things like a goalpost or a traffic signal. In the domain of entrepreneurship, instead of designing specifics like a goalpost or a football field, we can design scaffolds that enable exploration. That is, designing constraints that enable exploration and entrepreneurial self-organization towards a global optima, instead of being stuck in a local optima. But how to implement this idea? In an ill-structured, complex domain like entrepreneurship, we know following three important things. We clearly know that we cannot know specific dynamics that is going to happen. We can know certain dispositional propensities or stable patterns in the environment that can be called attractors, which will be discussed in a while. We know the fact that since the system is in dynamics, the acting agent must continuously explore the entrepreneurial state space to learn about the various features of the state space and affordances that enable entrepreneurial action. The design of context-sensitive constraints in this framework is based on these three key information. But there exists a practical step, that is, on what basis do we design the context-sensitive constraints? The solution to this problem is that we don't aim for specific dynamics, but for dimensionality. Aim for evolvable, flexible, macro-contextual constraints that are globally applicable to all or most of the entrepreneurial ventures. We should be designing scaffolds of enabling constraints by identifying approximate attractors in the state space. So let us have a look into attractor state. Self-organizing systems typically evolve towards a state of equilibrium or an attractor state. Once a system reaches there, the further dynamics and evolution of the system will likely be constrained to remain near such attractor or attractors. In other words, in a complex emergent system, an attractor is a set of states towards which a system will naturally gravitate and remain cycling through. They are islands of stability in a sea of chaos. Some of the examples are given here: weather patterns, biological systems, stock market behavior, social dynamics, neural network. All of these have very clearly demonstrable attractor states. But when I say specific examples, it shouldn't be mistaken that other systems do not have attractors. Attractor states is a ubiquitous feature. It can be visible in all kinds of systems. Now, with that understanding, let us now have a look at a great attractor state example that is relevant for our design, which was discussed in a comment given by none other than Jeff Bezos in an interview given by him. According to him, I very frequently get the question, what is going to change in the next 10 years? And that is a very interesting question. It is a very common one. I almost never get the question, what is not going to change in the next 10 years? And I submit to you that the second question is actually the more important of the two, because you can build a business strategy around the things that are stable in time. He further adds, in our retail business, we know that customers want low prices, and I know that is going to be true 10 years from now. They want fast delivery, they want vast selection. It is impossible to imagine a future 10 years from now where a customer comes up and says, Jeff, I love Amazon. I just wish the prices were a little higher. Or, I love Amazon. I just wish you would deliver a little more slowly. Impossible. And so the effort we put into those things, spinning those things up, we know the energy we put into it today will still be paying off dividends for our customers 10 years from now. When you have something that you know is true, even over the long term, you can afford to put a lot of energy into it. In this comment, Bezos was pointing to three key attractor states. They are low prices, fast delivery, and vast selection. These features are stable in time. It is not going to change in normal circumstances. So it can be considered as a kind of attractors. Now, the important thing to note here is that there can be massive number of attractor states in every systems and subsystems. So instead of being specific, I am here introducing 8 dimensionalities of entrepreneurial exploration in an arbitrary manner, along with infinite possibilities for the framework users to add their own contextualized attractor dimensions to enable exploration. So the 8 default exploratory dimensions that was introduced based on attractor dimension thinking are: number 1, the agent dimension. Number 2 is socio-material dimension. Number 3 is temporal and contextual factors. Number 4 is needs, wants, and choices. Number 5 is organization and delivery system. Number 6 is network and ecosystem disposition. Number 7 is atmosphere. And number 8 is unconventional forces. Now, even though these 8 exploratory dimensions are introduced as a kind of separate dimensionalities, it is important to understand that there is no clear-cut boundaries to these systems. There exist overlaps between these dimensionalities. So it is important to understand that we are using these dimensionalities not to represent the reality accurately, but as an instrument or a scaffold to enable exploration. This is just an instrumental use. It is not a real-world representation. That should be understood clearly. Now, even if the boundaries are true, it must be understood that boundary conditions in complex systems function not as walls, but as active sites like eardrums or membranes. Thus, these 8 dimensions are part of the same state space, hence encouraged not to see it as separate from the world. They are interconnected and single in its dynamics. By accepting this inseparable interconnectedness, it is easy for us to maintain a complexity perspective in mind when we are thinking about this framework. Now, the next key point I wanted to convey is that the entrepreneurial actor is expected to explore these 8 default exploratory dimensions, specifically focusing on dynamics of both cognitive and embodied real-world features and affordances related to each of these dimensions. The distinction between cognitive and real-world enactive affordances is made to stress on the fact that cognition and cognitive imagination is not equal to real-world action possibilities. This idea is not introduced to exclude cognitive dimension, which is not possible at all, but it is introduced to stress on the real-world affordances and action possibilities when we explore the 8 exploratory dimensions, and also to connect the cognitive ideas to real-world action possibilities. The key idea is that we have to redirect the entire propensity of the system to provide action possibilities for the entrepreneur. Another key point is that I am here not suggesting that this exploration should be directed for immediate action possibilities alone. This exploration should also be made to cultivate future action potential or affordances. For example, attending a networking event or helping somebody today might not provide you with immediate affordances, but might provide that in a future day. Now, let us have a look into each of these exploratory dimensions one by one. Let us start with the agent dimension. The first key exploratory dimension is the agent. This exploratory dimension is about knowing about and developing actionability related to the agent, that is the end user. This is the same end user to whom the entrepreneur catered to. This might include, for example, a dog, a baby, or an old person, and also the actual person who might make the decision to buy. It must be noted that there is no clear-cut boundaries here. The entrepreneur must explore this particular dimension of the state space continuously to develop various kinds of cognitive understanding and also develop action possibilities through this understanding. The second key exploratory dimension is socio-materiality of the agent or the end user. This is about socio-material dimension of the end user or the decision maker. This includes learning about and developing affordances related to the end user's social system and its dynamics, including technology and material aspects in which the agent is embedded. The third key exploratory dimension is temporal and contextual dimension of end user or decision maker. Every moment of an agent's life represents a different context, which include dimensions like time, situation, role, relationship, etc. In here, the context that is specific to the entrepreneurial end is important. It is from this context the needs will emerge, and at the larger scale, market opportunities arise. The fourth default exploratory dimension is the real needs, wants, and choices. Human needs are commonly used to refer to drivers of people's actions, the motives behind human behavior. Such needs arise out of specific contexts. Here, the entrepreneur is expected to pick up the nature of the needs, wants, and choices available to the end user, both in a cognitive and embodied real-world action possibilities perspective. For example, the cognitive exploration in this dimension might include learning about the hierarchy of needs, or the candy, vitamin, and painkiller analogy, or learn about the heuristics like jobs to be done. The real-world embodied and enactive dimension is about cultivating real-world action possibilities. The fifth key exploratory dimension is a startup effort or the organization itself, which is designed to deliver user needs. One of the fundamental functions of an entrepreneurial organization is to cater to human needs. The organization dimension here involves the entrepreneur, a product, or a startup. Now, it is important to understand that most of the entrepreneurship discourse and entrepreneurial models and methods, all of these can be seen as part of the organization or startup building process, meeting the end user needs and requirements. Even tools like business model canvas or the hook behavioral approach can be seen as part of these two exploratory dimensions. The sixth key entrepreneurial exploratory dimension is network and ecosystem disposition. This represents the direct connections or embeddedness of the organization, which is entrepreneur, product, or a startup, to an ecosystem or to the bigger environment. More specifically, we can think of it as the disposition of the organization in the ecosystem. Examples of ideas that might be interesting for cognitive exploration in this particular dimension includes network effect, platform thinking, platform models, network of partners, network of customers, etc. It is about direct connectedness and embeddedness of the organization. This might also include supply side and demand side path dependencies and models related to that. The seventh exploratory dimension is atmosphere as a whole. This includes general features of the entrepreneurship atmosphere or environment. For example, those represented by models like PESTLE, etc. But not limited to that. The PESTLE includes exploratory dimensions of political, economic, socio-cultural, technological, legal, environmental systems and affordances. So here also, the entrepreneur must explore the cognitive and real-world action possibilities. It might be interesting to note that in a cognitive level, the between zones of the sixth and seventh dimensions might include models like Porter's 5 forces or BCG metrics. So these dimensions can be explored in the between zones of the sixth and seventh. The eighth and final default exploratory dimension is unconventional forces. This includes things and forces that are unconventional, unknown, and unseen. These could be possibilities and threats that might happen, but not yet in place. Some examples that comes to mind are a corona type virus, future virus, new exponential technologies, artificial intelligence, direct and second order business and social impacts of apps like ChatGPT, other kinds of combinatorial innovations, etc. That's the end of the context-sensitive constraints introduction that was meant to enable exploration, provide affordances, and enable actionability. Since we completed this introduction, it is important to understand that these constraints are adaptable and changeable. Entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial mentors can add or change it to suit the requirements. Next important point to understand is that because each entrepreneur has unique disposition, the exploratory process, action, and affordances available to each of them might be different. A tech entrepreneur and shipping industry entrepreneur has different affordances and exploratory dimensions available. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk has different affordances and exploratory dimensions available. This idea needs to be kept in mind clearly. So that's the end of the introduction to the entire Eso-Loop framework. It has 8 default context-sensitive constraints and 6 default context-free constraints. But in the praxis part, I added 2 more context-free constraints. They are enskillment and enactive sense-making. That makes total 8 context-sensitive constraints and 8 context-free constraints, balancing both sides. So that's the end of the introduction to the 3 core parts of the Eso-Loop framework. To recap, I introduced the Eso-Loop framework as having 3 core components. As the first component, I introduced the worldview part, that is, a complex ecological worldview was introduced. The second key component was the primary keystone constraint, that is effectual self-organization, which involves a reminder that you are already a self-organizing system. It also involves a prompt to act like self-organizing systems, which include 4 dynamical heuristics. They are: understand your current disposition, act in the adjacent possible, make use of the coevolutionary potential of other systems, people, things, etc. And finally, leverage emergent and evolving reality. The third key component was the context-sensitive and context-free constraints. Context-free constraints comes before the specific context comes into being. Context-sensitive constraints emerges in the contextual dynamics. Though my use of context-sensitive constraints was not to represent this aspect clearly and accurately, but to design a solution for entrepreneurs. Now, another thing to note is that if you choose to do so, you can use the acronym astronaut, which was part of an earlier design of this framework. It is important to note that this is not a necessary part of this framework. It is totally a choice. I'm introducing this because I feel the endowment effect. I spent a lot of time designing this in the first version of this framework, which was developed 2-3 years back. So I feel some kind of emotional connection. So that is the only reason why I'm introducing it here. If you choose to do it, you can use it. There is no problem with that. It might help you remember all these ideas in a single acronym. So that's the end of the Eso-Loop Framework introduction. The image in the screen is a fairly good representation of the final idea of the Eso-Loop Framework. I plan to make 2 more sessions in this series. See you soon in the next session.